On Sunday, May 12, 2013, at 6:45 p.m., a distressed young woman ran into the central police station of Clermont-Ferrand, France. It was 25-year-old Cécile Bourgeon. Barely able to catch her breath, she explained that she had been relaxing in Montjuic Park with her two daughters, 3-year-old Eva and 5-year-old Fiona. While the girls were playing, Cécile had lain down on the grass and drifted off to sleep. She said she had only dozed for 20 to 30 minutes, but when she woke up, she discovered that her older daughter, Fiona, was missing. Cécile spent about an hour searching for her daughter on her own. She even called her boyfriend, Berkan Maklouf, to check if Fiona had somehow made it home alone. But Fiona was neither at home nor in the park. That's when Cécile rushed to the police to report her daughter's disappearance. Cécile explained that her daughter was just over 5 years old. Fiona lived with her mother's boyfriend, Berkan Maklouf, and her younger sister, Eva. Cécile and Berkan had been together for several months, and Cécile was expecting a child from him. She described Fiona as a very smart and quick-witted child for her age. The little girl wasn't afraid of people at all, so if someone spoke to her, she might have followed them. That was exactly what terrified her mother the most, that a stranger might have lured Fiona away. Police officers, firefighters, and even the army rushed to search Montjuic Park, which covered an area of 26 hectares. They were assisted by tracking dogs and 2 helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. However, night fell very quickly, and the search had to be called off. It resumed the following day. At the same time, the police held a briefing for the press and announced the phone number of a hotline for anyone who might have seen the girl. In the following days, the hotline received over 500 calls, all of which were carefully checked by the police. But at that moment, the main lead came from Cécile, who hinted that the father of Fiona and Eva, named Nicolas Chafoulet, might be involved in the kidnapping. Allegedly, he could have taken advantage of the mother's inattentiveness and taken the girl to his place. The police went to Nicolas's home. The man allowed them to search his house. The girls were not there. In fact, he only heard from the officers for the first time that his daughter was missing. He explained that he hadn't seen the girl for a long time because the mother was preventing their meetings. Nicolas said that he and Cécile met at school when he was 17 and she was 15. Soon the couple had their first daughter, Fiona, followed by her younger sister, Eva. The man explained that at first Cécile didn't mind their meetings with Fiona, but then she started to create obstacles, and some time ago even went to court demanding to restrict his visitation rights. Nicolas also described what he was doing on Sunday. The police checked his schedule, questioned relatives and acquaintances, and quickly confirmed that he was not in the park at the time Fiona disappeared. It quickly became clear that the child was not in the park, and the police moved on to the next phase of the investigation. Officers reviewed all surveillance camera footage from the streets and buses to see if anyone had spotted the child with a stranger. Investigators also interviewed more than 260 people who had previously been convicted of sexual offenses. Since Fiona was a very sweet girl with beautiful gray-green eyes, the police feared that she might have attracted the attention of a predator. Overall, the police did everything possible not to miss a single lead. The sheer volume of work and thoroughness with which they approached the investigation was impressive. At the same time, Cécile decided to appeal to the public. Dressed all in black, she spoke before journalists. The young woman looked shaken, yet heartfelt as she pleaded for the return of her little daughter. Without a doubt, all of France sympathized with the mother. It felt natural to empathize and show solidarity with Cécile. Of course, being a mother of 2 young daughters and expecting a child herself, she was very tired. She allowed herself to rest for just half an hour, during which time her child disappeared. This is the worst nightmare any mother could imagine, and everyone prayed for Fiona to be found as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the police focused on witnesses who were in Montjuic Park that Sunday evening. There were more than 30 such witnesses. The officers hoped that some of them might have seen or crossed paths with Cécile and her children. Indeed, a few people claimed to have seen her. The rest were less certain. Maybe they saw her, maybe they didn't. Maybe it wasn't even her. In any case, there were no solid facts to confirm with 100% certainty that Fiona was actually in the park on the evening of May 12th. Why couldn't the police simply take the claims of a mother driven nearly mad by worry at face value? Because from the very start of the investigation, there were small details that troubled the investigators. For example, when Cécile arrived at the station, she was dressed in white clothes, specifically white pants, yet she claimed she had been sleeping on the grass for almost half an hour. Okay, let's suppose that's true. But what were her daughters doing during that time, considering that there were no slides or any playground equipment near the spot where she said she slept? These were the first warning signs that made the police realize they couldn't take any testimony for granted and needed to verify everything thoroughly. Detectives decided to investigate Fiona's life before her disappearance. Surprisingly, they found out that since the beginning of the school year, Fiona had missed 42 days of kindergarten. The teacher said that in the last few weeks, Fiona was rarely seen. She barely showed up throughout April and almost the entire week before she vanished. The last time she was at kindergarten was on May 7th. One of the teachers noticed that Fiona looked pale. In fact, she used the word ghastly. Fiona was very thin, too thin for a girl her age. It seemed she was poorly fed, undernourished, and sleeping very little. However, the teacher did not notice any signs of abuse. Whatever the case, Fiona never returned to kindergarten. However, on May 8, 2013, the very next day, a surveillance camera caught Fiona with her mother, Berkani, and her little sister at a movie theater in a shopping mall. Fiona wore a headband that the police suspected was covering a bruise. They spoke with an employee of the cinema who had seen the family arrive. The woman was struck by the sight of the little girl who lagged behind her parents and sister. The witness said Fiona's face looked distorted around the temple area, appearing to have a large bruise, hematoma. She was so shocked she compared Fiona to a zombie and called her a walking corpse because of her grayish complexion. According to the witness, Fiona showed every sign of a child who was not well. The woman immediately thought Fiona was being mistreated. This was the last time Fiona was seen on camera with her family, and it gave the impression that she was suffering. It is worth noting that social services had never received any complaints or reports about Fiona. At that time, there was no evidence that she was a beaten or abused child. The detectives spoke again with Fiona's father, Nicholas, and asked if he had noticed anything unusual in his daughter's behavior or stories. Nicholas recounted an incident that had happened 6 months earlier. Fiona and Eva were at his house. While Fiona was taking a bath, she told her father, "Dad, Birkin hurt me." Naturally, Nicholas believed his daughter and arranged to meet with Birkin to demand an explanation. The meeting went as expected, heated and confrontational, and as Nikolai was leaving, he was so angry that he kicked a post to let off steam. He ended up breaking his leg. That was the last time Nicholas saw his daughter, because from that moment on, Cecile did everything she could to prevent their contact. She even went to a judge and requested that Nicholas be denied visitation rights. At the same time, Birkin began demanding that Fiona call him Dad. The police discovered that Birkin had several convictions for threats, violence, and theft. He himself had never known a better life because he suffered severe abuse and humiliation from his father and older brother. His mother couldn't protect him. She died of illness. Birkin grew up in a family where nobody cared about him. He had no one to hold on to, and he never had a family. Therefore, the arrival of Cecile and her daughters in his life was like a gift to him. Unfortunately, he couldn't appreciate this gift properly. People who knew him described him as someone capable of unjustified violence. He could lose his temper at any moment. His attitude toward the children became simply unbearable. The situation was made worse by the fact that both Cecile and Birkin were addicted to illegal substances, including some of the most dangerous ones. The couple showed no concern for the children living in this unhealthy environment, while Cecile and Birkin carelessly used drugs. The police quickly developed a feeling that the couple was hiding the truth from them. Unfortunately, this was just an intuition. There was no concrete evidence. But finally, here and there, clues began to emerge, suggesting that the couple was, at the very least, withholding information. The couple's neighbors told the police that they had seen Cecile's car on Sunday, May 12th at 5:45 p.m., parked near the house. This was strange, because if the car really was there at 5:45 p.m., then Cecile would have arrived at the park almost at 6 p.m. She would have barely had enough time to walk with the children to the spot where they were resting, and practically no time to sleep there. At some point, the detectives began to wonder whether the couple was manipulating them and had invented the entire scenario from start to finish. Meanwhile, while the detectives were searching for confirmation of their theory, quite strange and contradictory things were happening. A month after Fiona's disappearance, Cecile, smiling, shared some news with journalists that genuinely touched them. She told how she had changed the bed linen on Fiona's bed in her room and arranged her stuffed teddy bears. She did this so that when the girl returned, she would see the room in that state and know that her return was awaited and prepared for. Cecile admitted that such actions gave her a little hope, and it was very touching. Then in July, the couple decided to move together with little Eva to Perpignan, where Cecile's mother and stepfather lived. It was 600 kilometers from the city of Clermont-Ferrand. The police were baffled. How could they leave the city where their missing daughter had been searched for 2 months? It was beyond comprehension. But that wasn't all. When moving, the couple didn't take Fiona's belongings with them, and they rented an apartment that was too small for 4 people. That is, even if Fiona was found, there would be no place for her in the new apartment. It created the impression that Cecile and Birkin had decided to start a new life without her. The detectives examined Cecile's computer, and despite the fact that she had cleaned it, found some very interesting search queries. They found a news report about the search for 2 children who had gone missing from a park in Marseille. The news report was exactly the same as Cecile's own statement when she went to the police station after her daughter disappeared. In Marseille, the mother stated that she had come to the park with her 2 children, that she had fallen asleep for 20-25 minutes, and when she woke up, they were no longer there. This was exactly what Cecile had said. And if before the police had assumed that the girl had not disappeared from the park and that the family was hiding something, now they were convinced of it. Because Cecile had searched for this news before she reported Fiona's disappearance, it seemed as if Cecile was preparing a cover story to explain the baby's disappearance. Moreover, a doctor contacted the police, one whom Cecile and Birkin had approached. They had asked the doctor to provide a medical certificate to justify Cecile's absence from kindergarten for 21 days, but they did not bring the girl with them. The doctor agreed. On May 10th, he issued a certificate for Fiona. Interestingly, the girl had often missed kindergarten before, but the couple had never presented a medical certificate. So Cecile and Birkin's desire to obtain the certificate seemed particularly curious. Thus, the evidence against the couple was piling up like a snowball, but the police were in no hurry to arrest them. The thing was, Cecile was pregnant. If she were arrested, her detention in police custody would very quickly be canceled for medical reasons. In other words, she would be released before the police could interrogate her, which would mean losing the element of surprise. That's why the detectives were simply waiting. In August, Cecile gave birth to a baby boy. At the beginning of September, she contacted a journalist covering the case of her daughter's disappearance and complained that the police seemed to have sidelined her, weren't sharing any news with her, and that she was very unhappy about this. But in reality, the detectives were not sharing updates with Cecile because during the investigation, they had zeroed in on Cecile herself. On September 24th, the police arrested the couple. They were immediately separated to prevent them from coming up with a story to tell the detectives. The couple's behavior was drastically different. Birkin acted defiantly and aggressively, refusing to talk to the police or sign the document about his detention. He was practically forced into the police station and tried to resist arrest. Unlike her boyfriend, Cecile was very compliant. At the station, the detectives noticed that Cecile was covered in bruises. She reluctantly admitted that Birkin had been physically abusive towards her. The police focused all their efforts on her because they could not expect any cooperation from Birkin. Nevertheless, despite her outward softness and compliance, Cecile remained silent for a long time and insisted that her daughter had disappeared in the park. She did not waver from her testimony, despite the blatant implausibility of this version. It was only during the 4th interrogation that she decided to confess everything. Fiona had been dead for a long time. Cecile assured that she had cared for her daughter. However, judging by her words, in the days leading up to Fiona's death, she and her boyfriend were only thinking about where to get drugs. The situation reached its peak on the evening of May 11th. Fiona was agitated, didn't want to sleep, and was probably being fussy like many children her age. Only Birkin was in the room with her. Then Cecile heard a slap, and then another. Fiona was screaming and crying. Cecile entered the girl's bedroom to push the man away from the child and saw a bruise near Fiona's eye, which began to swell quickly. Cecile explained that she treated Fiona with arnica and put her to bed. The next morning, Birkin woke her up, saying Fiona's skin was cold. The couple realized the girl was dead. Birkin convinced Cecile not to call the police. He took the child in his arms, carried her to the bathroom, washed and dried her, then placed her in a large sports bag. He left a chain with a small medallion on the girl. Then the couple put the bag on the back seat of the car. They didn't know where to go until they reached the shore of Lake Ada, where they parked the car. 3-year-old Ava was with them all this time, sitting in her car seat on the back seat next to her older sister's body in the sports bag. The couple was lucky because near an abandoned cabin they found a shovel. Cecile and Birkin dug a shallow grave. They took Fiona out of the bag and placed her in the hole. But when trying to fill the grave, Birkin broke the shovel handle and had to finish with only half a shovel. Then they drove back. Upon returning to the apartment, they came up with what to tell the police. According to Cecile, Birkin came up with the story about Fiona's disappearance in the park. What happened next, the police already knew. After the confession, Cecile seemed sincere, and relief was noticeable. The detectives were convinced that at least part of her story was true. They had received what they feared, but had no doubt about the confirmation of Fiona's death. It was time to talk to Birkin. He continued to behave aggressively, protesting his arrest. When the police told him that Cecile had confessed, he didn't believe it. But when the detectives mentioned the broken shovel, he realized that only Cecile could have told them about it. Birkin admitted that he had spanked Fiona, but denied beating her. He added that on the night from Saturday to Sunday, he found Fiona vomiting. He put her back to bed, and in the morning discovered her cold, lifeless body in her room. When recounting that terrible night, Birkin was cold. It was almost unbearable to listen to. It was time to find Fiona's body. The police concluded that it would be easiest to take Cecile to the forest so she could show where they had dug the grave. The detectives boarded a police plane that picked Cecile up from the runway at Perpignan Airport. Under police escort, the young woman was brought to the area around Lake Adat. She tried to find the place where she and Birkin had dug a grave for Fiona, but couldn't locate it. It seemed she was genuinely trying to help. Moreover, her lawyer advised her to cooperate in finding the body because it would benefit her during the trial. But she kept pointing one way, then another. Perhaps she was just an excellent actress. When asked if she and her boyfriend had left any markers, she said no. Her intention had been never to return and to keep moving forward. Attempts to find Fiona were made several times, but were unsuccessful. The detectives wondered if she was deceiving them again. Could a mother really not remember under what circumstances her daughter was buried? Such a traumatic event couldn't be forgotten. But psychiatric experts explained that it was possible, especially considering Cecile's drug use. When the couple was brought back from Perpignan to Clermont-Ferrand, a crowd of several hundred screaming, frenzied people was waiting for them. They shook the cars, demanding Cecile be handed over to them for punishment. People who had passionately searched for Fiona realized Cecile had deceived them and wanted her to answer for what she had done. Charges were filed against the couple. Since Cecile did not strike Fiona, she was charged with offenses punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Birkin was charged with a crime that could send him to prison for 30 years. Both were taken into custody pending trial. The police suspected that perhaps the couple didn't want the body to be found because it could reveal something even more terrible that had been done to Fiona. For example, an autopsy might determine the severity of the beatings Fiona suffered in her final days. Or maybe they simply couldn't tell the truth. The fact was, on the evening of May 12th at 5:30 p.m., when Cecile supposedly went to the park, a neighbor saw Birkin throw a bag into the trash bin. The man was very surprised. He said, "Birkin never takes out the trash, but that day he was carrying a large trash bag." Because of this, the investigators suspected that the couple simply threw the body into the dumpster without any precautions. Could the couple tell the public, who was already demanding they be lynched, that they had dumped Fiona in the garbage? Of course not. They would never have been able to explain that. Next, as often happens in cases like this, the accused began blaming each other. Cecile claimed that Birkin had not been the first to raise his hand against Fiona, and that she often had to apply makeup to the girl to hide bruises. In turn, during a second interrogation, Birkin stated that Cecile also inflicted beatings on their daughter, and that she was the one responsible for Fiona's death. Since the body was not found, the police and the investigating judge did not know whom to believe. Yes, Birkin changed his testimony, but did he do it to reveal the truth about Cecile or to exonerate himself? After his statement, she was charged with the same offense as Birkin, intentionally causing grievous bodily harm under aggravating circumstances, which unintentionally resulted in the victim's death. Cecile, of course, denied beating her daughter. She admitted that she failed in her role as a mother and could not protect her daughter, but she did not beat her. When the trial began in November 2016, everyone hoped the defendants would speak up and reveal the location of Fiona's body. The courtroom was overcrowded, and people demanded the harshest punishment for Cecile. The audience exuded hostility toward her. By that time, Cecile was 29 years old. Birkin was 35. Birkin had become much calmer. His gaze was distant, yet he seemed to be the only one showing feelings and emotions about the trial. Cecile, on the contrary, was cold and withdrawn. Their defense strategy was that they were innocent and had done nothing wrong. Fiona's death was the result of an unfortunate accident. The prosecutor, for his part, demanded the maximum punishment for both, 30 years imprisonment for the crime they were accused of. However, the jury did not agree. Cecile was not found guilty of beating her daughter. Her guilt was recognized only in failing to provide assistance to a person in danger, filing a false crime report, and tampering with the crime scene. She was sentenced to 5 years and Birkin to 20 years in prison. Obviously, this decision was unexpected and caused a storm of outrage from the public who harbored hatred towards Cecile. That's why, when the verdict was delivered, the first thought that came to mind was not punishment for Cecile, who not only concealed the murder of her daughter, helped hide the body, but also tried to accuse an innocent man, Nicolas Chauffourier, of her kidnapping. Birkin also disagreed with the verdict. He considered it unbearable to be called a child murderer, even more unbearable than the fact of prison imprisonment itself. He filed an appeal, and the Court of Cassation overturned the sentence. Cecile, having served her 5-year sentence, was released pending a new trial. During the 1.5 years she spent free, she got married and had another child. According to a psychiatrist, this was her way of filling the void, as if it were the only freedom left to her, the freedom to have children. In December 2020, a new trial took place. Cecile behaved as if it didn't concern her at all. She gave evasive answers and even no longer knew how old Fiona would be now. Overall, she seemed to distance herself from what was happening, showing indifference and naturally irritating the jurors. She defended herself much worse, as if she believed she would simply leave the courtroom a free person, just as she had entered. As before, both defendants were tried for intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm under aggravating circumstances, resulting in the victim's death by negligence. They faced up to 30 years in prison. As a result, Cecile was sentenced to 20 years in prison and Birkin to 18 years. According to those present in the courtroom, the decision was quite symbolic. The 2-year difference was not significant, but it served as an important message, indicating the predominant role of Cecile in Fiona's death. Years passed, the body was never found, so what happened to Fiona remains unknown for sure. The truth is only partially known. Cecile and Birkin keep their secret, much to the despair of Fiona's father. According to the mother, it is only known that the day before her death, Fiona suffered from nausea and abdominal pain. The forensic expert testifying at the trial leaned toward the hypothesis that death resulted from abdominal trauma, the second most common cause of death in cases of severe abuse of minors. As a result of the trial, Cecile lost parental rights. Birkin Makhlouf retained his parental rights to Bilal, a boy born to Cecile in 2013. Bilal lives in a foster family. Eva, Fiona's younger sister, lives with her father Nicolas Chauffourier. It's been 30 years since 15-year-old Kipling Davis never came home from school, leaving all her personal belongings in her locker. The Davis family has spent a quarter of a century knowing only fragments of the story behind their daughter's sudden disappearance and living with the haunting rumors about what her friends might have done to her. Even now, there are pieces of the case that remain unresolved, and yet her parents still leave the porch light on every night. They won't turn it off until she's found. As another anniversary of her disappearance arrives, her parents are once again hoping to remind the world of Kipling, hoping that someone who knows the truth will finally come forward. Kipling Davis was an incredibly cheerful and friendly 15-year-old girl. Like many teenagers, Kipling was eager to get her driver's license. That meant waking up at 4:30 a.m. to get ready and attend early morning driving school classes before her regular school day. On the rainy morning of May 2, 1995, Kipling overslept. When her father, Richard Davis, came to wake her, she begged to skip driving school. She was going to be late anyway and hadn't had time to do her makeup or hair. But her parents knew how much getting her license meant to her, so they told her no. Kipling, understandably upset, stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. By the time she and her mother, Tamara Davis, arrived at driving school, she had calmed down, just as teenagers often do. When Kipling's father arrived home at 3:30 p.m., he noticed that his daughter still hadn't returned from school. At first, he wasn't too worried. He figured she might have stayed late for extracurricular activities or her drama club, which she attended regularly. So he decided to check the voicemail. Maybe Kipling had left a message. But to his surprise, there was a message from the school. They informed him that Kipling had missed her last 2 classes of the day. This shocked her parents. It was completely out of character. Kipling always called if she was going to be late. The whole family used the phone regularly, and not knowing where she was felt very unusual. Still, thinking back to the argument that morning, they wondered if Kipling might have been acting out in frustration. But when she still hadn't come home by 5 p.m., panic started to set in. They began calling her friends, Most of them said they last saw Kipling during lunch at school, but no one had seen her afterward, and she hadn't told anyone she planned on skipping class. By 7 p.m., her parents drove to the school, but there was no sign of Kipling. Then they tried the church, where she was a devoted member of the congregation. Again, nothing. Finally, Richard and Tamara made the call to police. But given the morning argument and the skipped classes, officers assumed Kipling had simply run away. That left her parents with no choice but to begin searching for their daughter on their own. They called all of Kipling's friends again and asked them to reach out to other classmates. Maybe someone had seen her at school. And then, unexpectedly, they got a lead from a boy named Eli, who went to school with Kipling. Eli said he saw Kipling during lunch, talking with a guy, Christopher Neil Jepson. He knew they were acquaintances through drama club. Still, Eli admitted he never liked Chris much, saying he just gave off a bad vibe. What Eli didn't know, though, was that Kipling's parents had already come across Chris's name. In their desperate search for answers, they'd found Kipling's diary, and in it, a recent entry described how she felt butterflies after hugging and kissing Chris. She seemed infatuated. The problem? Kipling wasn't allowed to date until she turned 16. Seeing that diary entry, her parents suspected she might be secretly seeing Chris and could even be hiding out at his house, so they drove there. But only Chris's sister was home. She told them she hadn't seen Kipling and that Chris was likely still at school. Apparently, he often stayed late in the drama room, adjusting lights, prepping the stage, or just hanging out with friends. Sometimes he stayed as late as 10 p.m. Kipling's parents rushed to the school, but by the time they arrived, it was already past 10. The doors were locked and the parking lot was empty. Something felt off. Not only was Kipling missing, but now Chris was nowhere to be found either. They returned to his house, now past midnight, and noticed more cars parked outside. One of them belonged to David Rucker Leifson, another student who had once asked Kipling on a date. That meant two boys who had shown romantic interest in her were together, the same night she vanished. Despite the suspicions, Kipling's parents didn't want to disturb the family in the middle of the night, so they went home. The next day, both police and Kipling's parents began questioning more students, hoping for any clue. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed Chris. He remained calm and cooperative. Yes, he had spoken with Kipling at lunch, but said he didn't know what she did afterward. He claimed to have been in the drama room until 11 p.m., hanging out with two other boys, David Rucker Leifson and Timmy Brent Olsen. They played football, listened to music. Just a typical night, he said. Chris even had a key to the room, so they often stayed late. Police followed up with the other boys, and both of them backed up Chris's story, word for word. With no evidence to the contrary, officers let them go and began looking elsewhere. And eventually, they found another suspect. There was another student from Spanish Fork High School who caught the investigators' attention, Brandon. On the very day Kipling disappeared, Brandon had asked her out on a date, and she had said yes. But later that day around lunchtime, he told Kipling he had a girlfriend who had found out about the date and was furious. Because of that, Brandon had to cancel their plans. Then something unusual came to light. Brandon had also missed the same last two classes of the day, just like Kipling. Naturally, the police wondered whether the two had skipped class together, despite his girlfriend's anger. But Brandon had an explanation. He claimed that after canceling their date, he felt guilty and tried to find Kipling at school to apologize. When he couldn't locate her, he realized he was already late for class and decided not to go at all. Instead, he drove home. On the way, he said, he got a flat tire, something he claimed his friend could verify. But when police spoke to that friend, he denied everything. He said Brandon never had car trouble, and he definitely didn't help him fix a flat tire that day. The inconsistency raised red flags, but the police couldn't do much. There were no solid leads, no evidence of a crime, no witnesses who could say for certain what had happened. Some people in Spanish Fork claimed they saw Kipling in a car on Main Street later that day, but those sightings were never verified. Meanwhile, all of Kipling's personal belongings, her bag, makeup, retainers, and school books, were still sitting untouched in her locker. And as time passed, chilling rumors began to spread that Kipling's final resting place might be somewhere deep in Spanish Fork Canyon. A year after Kipling's disappearance, something unexpected happened. Chris showed up at the Davis family's doorstep. He told Kipling's father that he needed to get something off his chest. Richard Davis's heart sank. He thought Chris was finally going to confess something terrible, but all the boy said was, "I didn't do anything to Kipling." To Richard, it didn't make sense. Why would someone go out of their way to say something so vague and pointless? Unless they were hiding something? He pressed Chris for more answers, growing more intense with each question. Maybe too intense. Chris abruptly left without saying anything more. Still, the whole exchange was bizarre enough for Mr. Davis to contact the police. Investigators decided to re-examine the boy's original alibi and brought up the idea of a polygraph test. That was when Tim Olson cracked. He offered a brand new version of what had happened the day Kipling vanished. According to him, after lunch, he, Kipling, and Rucker had gone to the canyon. At some point, Kipling and Rucker split off together, leaving Tim behind. Only Rucker came back. Detectives were encouraged. They felt they were finally closing in on the truth. But suddenly, Tim panicked. He grabbed the written statement he'd just started drafting, crumpled it up, and tossed it away. Then he completely walked back his confession and returned to the original story. Even so, police went forward with the polygraph tests and were stunned by the results. All three boys passed. Still, officers organized a search of the canyon just in case Tim's story had any merit, but the search came up empty. After that, the investigation began to lose momentum. With no body, no solid evidence, and no confession they could use, there was little the police could do. But Kipling's parents never sat idly by. They wrote to every authority they could think of, tirelessly pushing for her case to be heard by a grand jury. At first, their request was denied. But in March 2003, after learning that a grand jury had been convened to investigate the disappearance of 15-year-old Elizabeth Smart from Salt Lake City, Richard and Tamara Davis demanded a meeting with U.S. Attorney Paul Warner. Warner agreed to convene a grand jury and reopen the investigation into Kipling's disappearance. For nearly a decade, what happened to Kipling remained a chilling mystery, until federal and local authorities began to unravel what appeared to be a pact of silence among a small group of people, including several of Kipling's classmates. Chris, Rucker, Tim, and two other young men, Scott Brunson and Gary Blackmore, were charged with perjury. All but Blackmore had gone to school with Kipling. Each of the five had lied under oath to the grand jury about what they knew the day Kipling vanished. When news of the perjury charges broke, the community began turning against the young men. Multiple witnesses came forward with disturbing stories, accounts of the boys allegedly making chilling admissions about what happened to Kipling. One of the most unsettling came from Chris's own wife. She described watching a movie with him when she jokingly asked, "What's the worst thing you've ever done?" She said Chris looked her dead in the eyes and replied, "What if I told you I killed Kipling Davis?" He quickly brushed it off as a joke, but she could never quite shake the feeling that maybe it wasn't. Around the same time, investigators discovered something shocking. Rucker had reportedly shown up at Tim's house and threatened him, warned him not to ever bring up his name in connection with Kipling again. And perhaps the biggest revelation of all, the night Kipling disappeared, the school auditorium where the boys claimed to have been hanging out, changing light bulbs and playing football, wasn't even available. A choir concert had taken place that night. There was simply no way the boys could have been there doing what they said. How that detail slipped through the cracks in the early days of the investigation remains a haunting question to this day. But regardless, charges were brought against Chris and Tim. That was enough for Tim, who decided to confess, though not completely. He said that he, Kipling, and another boy went to the canyon. Kipling and the other person, whose name Tim refused to reveal, walked a bit farther ahead. Tim assumed they wanted a moment of privacy, but when they didn't return after 10 minutes, he went to look for them. When he caught up, he claimed to have seen that the other boy had killed Kipling, and that Tim had to help him hide her body. Essentially, this story was nearly word for word what he had previously tried to tell police, back when he named Rucker. But this time he was adamant about not revealing the killer's name, or where Kipling's body had been hidden. Despite Tim's confession, it didn't clarify the case. It only raised more questions. Was he admitting to a lesser crime to avoid a first-degree murder charge? Was he truly a witness who helped move the body? Or had he committed the murder himself and invented the second person? Or was he taking the fall for reasons known only to him? If he was protecting someone, that person must have been very important to him. And why was Tim so determined not to reveal the location of the girl's body? Could it be because, if found and analyzed, the body would reveal something horrific that the boys had done to her? After all, a whole group of people participated, at the very least, in lying and covering up the crime. That makes it all the more baffling that none of them accepted a plea deal, in exchange for revealing the truth and the location of her remains. Deals that would have been extremely favorable. In any case, murder charges, intentional or otherwise, were never brought against the person who allegedly killed Kipling because Tim never named him in court. Prosecutor Marion O'Brien stated in 2011 that she believed the person Tim was protecting was David Rucker Leifson. But even if Tim had named Rucker, it would have been difficult to prosecute, as Tim had already been convicted of perjury and his testimony alone would not have been enough to build a case. On the other hand, police had 5 pages of witness statements from people who knew Tim, detailing numerous instances where he had allegedly confessed to killing Kipling. Several individuals told police they had heard or spoken directly with Tim about the murder of Davis. "I can make someone disappear," he told one person. "I did it once, I can do it again." The documents also stated that Olson had told several people where the girl's body was located, though each time he mentioned a different place: the canyon, under railroad tracks, in a sand grave. Authorities spent years searching for her remains and stated that it wasn't the weather, but the imprecise information about the location that prevented them from finding her. "It wouldn't matter how deep the ground was under the snow. If we knew the exact spot, we would be there," said Police Lieutenant Steve Adams. "We searched several locations provided by different sources, and we didn't find her." Police believe that Kipling was raped and murdered, and that several people who either knew her or knew the perpetrators are covering for the criminals. They believe that Rucker and Tim were responsible for her presumed death, and the other boys helped them fabricate an alibi to avoid punishment. Davis thanked Tim for his confession, saying he forgave him, but he pleaded with him to tell the police where the body was. Despite extensive searches, Kipling was not found. When asked why he thought Olson continued to stay silent and withhold vital information, Davis replied, "I wish I knew." The pain of losing their daughter hit the family again in 2017 when the body of another missing girl from Spanish Fork was discovered. Peggy Sue Case had been missing even longer than Kipling, since 1988. A Spanish Fork resident named Gordon Kazier had noticed a depression in the earthen floor of his basement, but ignored it for years. In May 2017, he asked a friend to help him move. During the move, the friend asked if Gordon knew that a girl who had lived in the house before him had gone missing. This was news to Gordon, and the two men began digging. The depression in the basement corner was covered by a rug with a heavy table on top, Gordon later said. "We dug about 1.5 feet down and found a blanket. My friend asked for a knife and cut into the blanket. Inside, we found a shocking discovery. A human skull was staring back at us." Michael Kufrin, Peggy Sue Case's boyfriend, was arrested in Illinois and brought back to Utah, where he was charged with her murder. Interestingly, the house was located just 2 blocks from the Davis home. "I drove straight over there and talked to the police," Kipling's father recalled. "The guy noticed a depression in the floor. That's a miracle. I need a miracle like that. That's what we need." Davis has dedicated over 1/3 of his life to searching for his daughter. For years, he searched canyons, fields, rivers, and ditches, digging anywhere a grave might be hidden. Though the family has never gotten answers, Kipling's father explains that they no longer care about trials or charges. All they want is to bring their daughter home. "It feels like she's suffering, like she's cold," he said, describing what it's like not knowing where she is. Although Kipling's family still keeps the porch light on, they no longer hope that she will one day walk through the door. She was officially declared deceased on May 2nd, 1995. Darkness. Complete, all-consuming darkness. Michelle Hoffman never forgot her first encounter with it. "I remember being excited about my first year at Camp Scott because the woods are so dark at night," she recalls. "If you've never camped in a tent in the deep woods, it's a little scary. After your first camp, you'll be ready. You know it's going to be dark and gloomy." For Girl Scouts, dark nights were part of the experience at Camp Scott, where they spent 2 weeks of the summer each year. Michelle first went to camp at age 9, and she loved it. Swimming, hiking, camping. She was happy to return every summer, but Michelle's 7th summer was different. At 15, she was almost an adult, no longer a Girl Scout, but a young assistant to the camp director. Something else had changed too, though she didn't know it yet. Contrary to her childhood imagination, no night before that June of '77 had ever really held any real horrors. But in the summer of '77, a monster lurked in the darkness of the night that had never before disturbed the peace of Camp Scott. On the morning of Sunday, June 12th, when Michelle arrived at the camp headquarters in Tulsa, the parking lot was already full. There were 140 girls preparing for the trip to camp, but one in particular stood out, Michelle says, recalling her first meeting with Denise Milner. The 10-year-old was about to go to camp for the first time, and it was obvious that she was nervous. Doris Denise Milner had worked hard to sell enough cookies to attend camp for the first time. Her friends had decided not to go that year, so she was a little nervous, but still excited about the opportunity to make new friends. Michelle came over and introduced herself to Denise and her mother, Betty Milner. Betty explained that the girl had gotten scared at the last minute and didn't want to go to camp anymore. I convinced the girl to sit next to me on the bus. Her mother asked me to call her if she was sad at camp the next day, and I assured her I would. But I was confident I wouldn't have to, because the counselors were doing everything they could to make sure the girls had a great time, Michelle recalls. I kept saying, "You're going to love it. You're going to have a great time." Michelle, who was 15 herself, was sincere and meant it. After saying their final goodbyes, 140 scouts boarded buses for the trip to the small farming community of Lacoste Grove, about 50 miles northeast in Oklahoma, where the Girl Scouts owned 410 acres known as Camp Scott. Since 1928, Camp Scott has provided girls with a variety of recreational and educational activities, including hiking, swimming, arts and crafts, picnics, and singing in the great outdoors. The 2 weeks of camp offered relaxation, friendship, and excitement. On the outskirts of Locomotive Grove, the buses turned south at an intersection of 2 roads. A green sign directed drivers down a narrow road called the Cookie Trail to the Girl Scouts campsite. The camp was divided into sections named for the Native American tribes of Osage, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, Comanche, Cherokee, Quapaw, Arapaho, and most remotely, Kiowa. There were 27 girls assigned to the Kiowa section, which was located at the western end of the campground. The last tent in the section was Tent 8. The 3.5-by-4- tropical tent was on a wooden platform 90 meters from the nearest counselor's tent and 23 meters from the nearest neighboring tent. Denise Milner was assigned Tent 8, along with 9-year-old Michelle Goose and Lori Lee Farmer, who would be celebrating her 9th birthday later that week. The 4th girl was supposed to join them the next day. Michelle Hoffman helped Dennis get used to the camp, leading her to tent number 8. She even admitted that it was once her favorite tent. As the Girl Scouts were eating dinner in the dining hall at about 6 p.m., a thunderstorm broke out. After dinner, the girls wanted to wait for the rain to stop, but it kept pouring and pouring, so everyone went to their tents. Denise, Lori, and Michelle unpacked their things and started getting ready for bed. Denise quickly made friends with her tent mates and told them about her family. In turn, Lori said she was a big sister to her 4 siblings. Michelle came from Broken Bow, but found it easy to get along with Denise and Lori, who came from Stalsey. Lori unpacked 2 decks of cards and wrote a letter to her family before the lights went out. "I made 2 new friends," she wrote. "We share a tent, we sleep on camp beds. I couldn't wait to write to you. Love, Lori." Michelle Hoffman returned to the tent once more to check on the girls. They were getting ready for bed and seemed to have settled into their new surroundings. "Good night, see you in the morning," she said to Dennis. A few minutes later, she climbed into her own bed. Despite the storm, the first day had gone well, and she was confident that everyone would be well rested and ready for more adventures on Monday. At about 1:30 a.m. on June 13th, Carla Sue Wilhite, a camp counselor, grabbed a flashlight and went to check out a suspicious intermittent moaning sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere near the intersection of the camp trail and the dirt road leading to the parking lot. The sounds were about 140 meters away from Tent 8. When Carla couldn't find the source of the noise, she decided it was just animals in the woods and there was no reason to raise the alarm. So she went back to her tent and slept. At 2 in the morning, one of the Girl Scouts in Tent 7 saw someone pull back the tent flap and shine a light inside. She couldn't see the person's features, only that it was the silhouette of a large man. The flap closed again and the unknown person left. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a girl in the Cherokee section of the camp heard a scream coming from the direction of the Kiowa camp. Another girl in Quapaw also heard someone calling for her mother, and she thought she recognized the voice of Lori Farmer, with whom she had once camped. The girl knew that Lori sometimes had nightmares, so she saw no reason to raise the alarm and went back to sleep. The foul weather had cleared overnight, and Monday morning was bright and clear. It was the kind of morning when you breathe in a breath of fresh air with pleasure. The forest was clean and fresh. The earth smelled good. It was supposed to be a wonderful day. At 6 in the morning, Carla woke up and went to take a shower. When she approached the place where the strange sounds came from during the night, she saw 3 sleeping bags lying under a tree. One was yellow with a checkered pattern. The second was green, and the third had flowers on it. Upon examining them more closely, Carla was horrified to see the lifeless body of Denise Milner, partially covered by a yellow sleeping bag. In the other sleeping bags, Carla found Michelle and Lori. The counselors responded quickly, but nothing in the Girl Scout handbook could have prepared them for something like this. They were still responsible for all the other girls at camp, and they gathered them in the dining hall for breakfast. In an attempt to protect them from trauma, the counselors pretended that everything was normal. Within minutes, the first officers arrived on the scene, cordoned off the murder scene, and kept journalists away while they collected evidence. However, it didn't take long for the world to learn of the tragic incident. At 8 a.m. on Monday, June 13th, as Tulsa residents began another work week, the first news broke. It seemed so unbelievable that many asked a second and third time before they were sure they had it right. 3 Girl Scouts had been found dead at Camp Scott. At first, no one knew if a crime had been committed or an accident, but soon new details emerged and they were shocking. Michelle and Lori had been killed by violent blows, and Denise, although her face had also been damaged, had died of strangulation, but not before they had been abused. The police were looking for the killer or killers. Michelle Hoffman answered the phone that terrible day. It rang all day, without stopping. She got home only in the evening and finally gave in to her tears. But the worst blow was not to come until a few days later. She was sitting with her parents in the living room, reading the newspaper with the latest news about the murders. She looked at the photos of the girls and read the names: Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Goose, Taurus Denise Milner. And suddenly she felt very sick. She remembered the bus ride, the little scared girl, and her last words, "Good night, see you in the morning." It all came back to her suddenly. Until then, the girl's first name, Taurus, had blinded her to the truth. "Oh no, Mom," the girl cried. "That's the girl I was riding the bus with. That's Denise." The triple murder of the Girl Scouts stirred up memories of another high-profile case in the United States, the murder of a girl counselor, Peggy Beck, which was remarkably similar to the cases of Denise, Michelle, and Lori. Peggy Beck was 16 years old on August 17, 1963. She was a camp counselor at Flying Ranch in the Pike National Forest southwest of Denver. It's easy to picture the landscape: craggy mountains and tranquil lakes surrounded by Douglas fir and magical yellow pine. The girl's real name was Margaret, but she preferred Peggy. She was a student at Denver High School, enjoying the last few weeks of summer vacation before she had to return to school. It was Sunday evening, and everyone was packing up for the trip home the next day. That night, she took part in the campfire songs. Maybe she told the other children scary stories based on urban legends. And if she chose to tell such a story, she probably did it with emotion, changing her voice and intonation so that the children would feel the full horror of what was happening in the story. No one could have known that they were only a few hours away from a true horror story. Once the fire songs were sung, the boys settled into their sleeping bags and Peggy returned to her tent. There were 24 children and 3 adults in the group, but Peggy's tent was said to be 30 feet from the rest of the group. Usually she didn't sleep alone, but with her friend Claudia Schreit. But Claudia felt unwell and decided to spend the night in the infirmary. The next morning, Peggy didn't show up for breakfast, so Claudia went to wake her, but Peggy couldn't be woken up. She was dead. Initially, it was believed that she had died of natural causes, but on August 21, 1963, the coroner stated that finger marks had been found on the girl's throat, which had not immediately become apparent. The coroner concluded that the girl had been molested and strangled. During the initial investigation, the police had no reason to suspect anyone connected with the camp. If you think about it for a second, the circumstances of the girl's death were horrific. How did the killer know that she was sleeping alone in the tent that night? He must have been watching her. Was he waiting nearby, watching from the safe cover of the forest? When she entered the tent alone just before midnight, the predator was watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Did he suddenly appear in her tent while she was sleeping? Did he put his hand on her face to stop her from calling for help from the other counselors just 30 feet away? We know that Peggy put up a violent fight and that she likely had bits of the gunman's skin under her fingernails because newspapers reported that investigators were looking for a suspect with scratches on his face. Police reportedly questioned a man in Cannon City, Colorado, days later because he had scratches on his face. According to media outlets covering the story in 2020, police questioned other suspects in the months that followed, including James Charbondy. He served 25 years in prison for the murder of a sheriff's deputy and had stopped dating his parole officer around the time of Peggy's murder. The police did everything they could, but they simply ran out of other leads. Peggy's mother lived another 11 years, dying in 1974, never knowing who killed her eldest daughter. Investigators assigned to look into the murders of Girl Scouts Denise, Lori, and Michelle, as well as reporters covering the case, called the killer a beast. The brutality of the attack was evident in the victim's wounds. Catching the killer became a priority for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Evidence found near the bodies included a large roll of black duct tape and a red and white 9-volt flashlight. The lens of the flashlight was covered with a piece of green film from a garbage bag. The perpetrator had used the tape to attach the green film to the flashlight. There was a piece of newspaper sandwiched between the battery compartment of the flashlight. It was dated April 17th and was a clipping from the Tulsa World. Investigators also discovered that someone had robbed some of the tents the night of the murders and taken, among other things, a pair of sunglasses belonging to counselor Susan Emery. The first suspect the investigation focused on was Jack Schroff, a rancher near Camp Scott. Duct tape was found in his home, as well as rope similar to the one used to tie the two girls' hands. However, Schroff claimed that thieves had broken into his home and taken a number of items. He explained that the items found at the ranch were purchased to replace the stolen items. The man was asked to take a polygraph test, which he successfully did. He then had a solid alibi for the night of the murders, and as a result, he was no longer considered a suspect. Police checked with mental hospitals and state prisons for inpatient lists and sex offender histories. Then, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agent Arthur Linville became interested in a rapist and runaway whose mother lived less than a mile from Camp Scott. His name was Gene Leroy Sonny Hart. Hart was a Cherokee born on November 27, 1943, in Claremore, Oklahoma. He was raised by his mother and barely knew his father. He did not do well in school, but excelled in sports and was able to attend college on a football scholarship. Instead, he decided to get married, and soon he and his wife became parents. Up until then, Hart seemed happy, but something changed, and he became irritable and rude. In 1966, Hart confessed to kidnapping and abusing 2 pregnant women. He was sentenced to 3 10-year prison terms, but because the terms were to run concurrently, he was released early after only 28 months. In 1970, Hart was convicted of a series of home burglaries and sentenced to McAllister. In April 1973, he was transferred from McAllister to Pryor Creek so he could appear for a retrial for his 1966 crime. He escaped from prison but was recaptured a month later. He escaped again in September 1973 and was still at large when the girls were murdered 4 years later. 3 days after the murders, 2 squirrel hunters found a flour sack in front of a cave nearly 3 miles southwest of Camp Scott. Believing someone might be hiding in the cave, they contacted the highway patrol. Inside the cave, investigators found photographs of 2 women, a roll of duct tape with part of a garbage bag stuck to it, 2 pieces of newspaper, and broken sunglasses in a beige case. The newspaper turned out to be the April 17th issue of the Tulsa World, and counselor Susan Emery recognized her glasses. Investigators tracked down photographs from Dalloway Lynchus, who worked at the prison when Hart served time there. Lynchus worked as a photographer and worked on the pictures in the prison's darkroom. Hart helped develop the film. Dick Wilkerson, an agent with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, theorized that Hart kept the pictures because one of the women reminded him of his wife. This gave police a connection between Hart and the case. The cave was linked to the crime scene, and Hart was linked to the cave. When the public learned that Hart was accused of murdering the girls, his friends and relatives who believed in his innocence rallied around him. He had 250 relatives living in the camp area who were eager to help him. Hart was also able to live off the riches of the land. The northeastern Oklahoma area offered plenty of fish and game and plenty of places to hide. Throughout the summer of 1977, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agents used dogs and tried to spot Hart from the air. They battled heat, humidity, and ticks, but it was as if they were chasing a ghost. One of the agents, Harvey Pratt, was a Cheyenne Arapaha and a strong believer in Indian mysticism. When Dick Wilkerson and his brother, Agent Mike Wilkerson, wrote a book about the Girl Scout murders, they quoted Pratt, "The Indian people in that part of Oklahoma believe that medicine men have potions so powerful that they can transform themselves into birds or animals, or give someone that power. Such people are called shapeshifters or metamorphs." Pratt and others who thought like him believed that Hart had a powerful potion that helped him. As the months passed, former football star Gene Hart became a living legend. At some point, the dogs came across another small cave about a mile away from the crime scene. In black ink, written on the wall of the cave, was June 17, 1977. The real killer was here. The sheriff believed the message was written by the killer, but this theory had many critics who did not believe that the killer would hide in the woods with black ink. But the sheriff said that if the cave was easy to find, I might think it was a hoax, but it was very difficult to get to, and we had a hard time finding it. Although the cave gave few clues, it supported the theory that the killer was hiding in the woods. In late September 1977, more than $20,000 had been raised from various sources, and that was enough for an informant to offer police help in capturing Hart. He told police that a relative of the suspect planned to take him to the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina. The agents planted a tracking device on a relative's car, but the plan failed when one of Hart's supporters, who worked at police headquarters, reported the bug to his family. Throughout the winter, investigators spent long nights in the woods in sub-zero temperatures, continuing to monitor areas where they believed Hart might be hiding. Finally, they got a break. Their informant learned that Hart was living with an elderly man in a shack in the Cookson Hills, between the towns of Tahlequah and Salissa. On April 6, 1978, the agents surrounded and surprised Hart. Not a single shot was fired. The agents couldn't contain their joy. The hunt lasted 10 months, took more than 10,000 hours and $2 million in taxpayer money. Hart hid for 5 years in a 65 square kilometer area. Now the question arose, could the prosecution prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jean Leroy Hart was guilty of murder, or was the killer still at large? Before the trial, interest in the murder forced the prosecution to seek another venue for the trial, but the request was denied. The trial took place in March '79. Prosecutor Buddy Fallis Jr. was assigned to assist District Attorney Sid Wise, who was under scrutiny for his alleged intention to write a book about the case. Hart's defense was assigned to Garvin Isaacs. Not a single member of the jury that would decide Hart's fate was a Native American. The case against Hart got off to a rocky start, starting with the way police handled the crime scene. In the tent where the victims slept, investigators found a handprint and a bloody shoe print. The handprint turned out to belong to an Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agent, and the shoe print was too small to be connected to Hart. A fingerprint found on a flashlight at the crime scene was not Hart's. The body fluid collected at the crime scene posed an unsolvable puzzle for the prosecution. Hart had undergone a vasectomy several years earlier and was theoretically incapable of producing semen. The prosecution argued that the vasectomy performed on Hart by the 78-year-old doctor was only partially successful. Doctors advising the prosecution in the case said such an incident could have resulted in unproductive body fluid. Hart had type O blood. He was also a secretor, meaning someone whose saliva and other body fluids contain traces of water-soluble agglutinogens that determine a person's blood type. The sample found on the victims came from a non-white male who was a secretor with blood type O and non-fertile seminal fluid. The number of people in the United States who met those criteria was negligible. Forensic experts also testified that a hair found on Denise was microbiologically identical to Hart. But this was before DNA testing, and the defense argued that similar meant just that, similar but not identical. Two key pieces of evidence were a souvenir corncob pipe and a small blue mirror found in a shack belonging to an old man named Sam Pigeon. Hart lived there with Pigeon after the murders. Karen Mitchell, a counselor at Camp Scott, identified the pipe and mirror as hers, claiming they had disappeared around the time of the murders. The problem was that investigators only seized the pipe and mirror after they decided to conduct a second sweep of the shack. Sam Pigeon said he had never seen the items. As a result, Hart's supporters and his attorney began to suspect that the evidence had been planted by agents desperate to close the case. Isaacs also questioned the work of Sheriff Pete Weaver. One of Weaver's former supervisors claimed to have seen some of Hart's belongings in Weaver's desk, things that later turned up in a cave allegedly used by Hart as one of his hideouts. The prosecution wrapped up its case in 6 days. Then the defense took the stand. In addition to attacking the forensics and the officer's actions, Isaacs introduced an alternative suspect, Bill Stevens, who, like Hart, was a convicted rapist. A woman named Joyce Ellen Payne and her common-law husband, Dwayne Peters, knew Stevens and said he had borrowed a red and white flashlight from them a few days before the murders, and they had seen him with what appeared to be blood on his shoes. He told the couple that his car had broken down in Locust Grove. Stevens denied the allegations, claiming he had never been in the area, yet Kimberly Lewis, a Girl Scout, testified that she had seen a man who looked like Stevens at camp. The prosecution countered by saying that hair and body fluid samples from Stevens ruled him out as a suspect. It was possible that other suspects were involved. Police saw strange men near the camp on the day of the murders, and suspicion grew that there was more than one perpetrator involved, as there were several victims. Interestingly, before the murders, camp staff found a threatening note. The note stated that several little girls would be killed. The camp director dismissed the incident as a joke and took no safety precautions. Hart did not testify at the trial. The jury retired for the night without reaching a verdict. The next morning, they were ready with a decision. Not guilty. Emotions were running high. Joy and relief on the part of the defense, sadness and disbelief on the part of the prosecution. The jury noted that the investigation was poorly conducted and there was insufficient evidence to convict without question. After the trial, Hart returned to prison to continue serving his sentence for robbery. Within a year, he died. The official cause of death was a heart attack. While Hart's trial was ongoing, the media speculated about whether the same Camp Scott employee might have once worked at the Colorado camp where Peggy Beck was murdered in 1963. But prosecutor Sid Weiss said they found no evidence to connect the two cases. In fact, not only could they not tie Hart to Peggy Beck, they could not even prove that Hart was guilty of murdering 3 Girl Scouts. It is easy to imagine that after a decade of uncertainty, Peggy's family, her father and sisters, probably believed they would never get answers. In 2007, biological material from Peggy's body was tested for DNA, and a DNA profile of the perpetrator was created. Investigators entered it into the FBI database. If the criminal was ever arrested and DNA was taken, it would be known. But the effort was in vain, and in 2007, that was the limit of DNA technology. Without a match, the criminal continued to elude prosecution. In 2009, Peggy's father died at age 88. He never found out who killed his daughter. Finally, in June 2019, Colorado detectives returned to the case and conducted a more comprehensive DNA analysis. The resulting profile allowed them to find a match. Investigators found a relative of Peggy's killer and were able to reconstruct the family tree, narrowing the number of suspects to a minimum. Detectives met with a family member, asked a few questions about the person's relatives, and the information they received led them to a likely suspect. James Raymond Taylor investigators confirmed that Taylor lived in Colorado in the early 60s. At the time of Peggy's murder, he was married and worked as a TV repairman. The guy was only 23 years old. The evidence was so compelling that police issued a warrant for Taylor's arrest and looked into his background. He had a record of offenses in Las Vegas dating back to the 1970s. They were also able to find out that Taylor had lived in Colorado in the early 1960s, the same time and city where Peggy and her family lived. However, they could not establish whether Taylor knew Peggy Beck or whether he could have been stalking her specifically. One theory was that Taylor simply stumbled upon the young counselor while doing his job. Perhaps they could ask him all the questions in person, but no, they can't because the police can't find him. Yes, they had a warrant out for his arrest for Peggy's murder in '63, but James Raymond Taylor had disappeared, and his family said he had been missing since the '70s. The last anyone knew of him was living in Las Vegas in '76. And after that, nothing. Peggy's parents didn't live long enough for the police to finally track down their daughter's killer, but her sisters have an answer to the question that's been plaguing them and can move on with their lives. Will parents Denise, Michelle, and Lori ever know for sure who attacked their daughters that fateful night in 1977? Was it Hart? Did he have an accomplice that the police never even suspected? And could it have been one of the most notorious serial killers in human history? Many believed and still believe that Hart was guilty of the crime, but the evidence supports the theory that he was not alone and had an accomplice. At the very least, that would explain the fingerprint that was found, which did not belong to Hart. It is difficult to imagine how Hart killed 3 girls alone, considering that no one heard the noise of 10-8. If there were at least 2 criminals, then it would be easier to guarantee silence. The media reported that the knots used to tie the girls' wrists looked different, suggesting that the knots were tied by different people. At the same time, the girls were attacked in different ways, which also suggests at least 2 attackers. The girls were found more than 100 meters from their tent, meaning they were carried there. Perhaps the perpetrator wanted to take them away from the camp, which was also not easy for one person. It is also strange that Hart, who had never killed anyone before, went on to kill 3 girls at once. And the brutality of the crime does not mean that it was the first such murder. In 2008, biological fluids found in the tent were examined for DNA using modern capabilities, but no answers were obtained due to the very old age of the samples being examined. However, the test showed the presence of female DNA. The test failed to rule out all 3 girls or the possibility of a female perpetrator, adding new questions rather than providing answers to the existing mystery. Lori's mother said, "I always felt there was a girl, so when I saw the DNA tests, it bothered me." Experts were finally able to rule out the possibility that it was Lori's DNA, as well as one of the other girls, but they couldn't rule out all 3. Given the DNA results, one wonders if a woman was involved in the murders. As recently as 2017, new Sheriff Mike Reed created a fund to raise money and conduct more DNA testing on the remaining samples, this time using even more advanced technology. The results of this venture are still unknown. It is also curious that, according to unconfirmed sources, Ted Bundy was in the area around the time of the murders. Could he have had anything to do with the case? He was never able to give a clear and precise answer to the question of how many people he killed. And the way the Girl Scouts were killed is a bit like his style. Yes, they were younger than his typical type, but couldn't he have simply taken advantage of the opportunity when it came his way? However, frankly speaking, this is the most unlikely version, if only because you would have to know that forest very well to hide there and wait, and then commit the crime in the dark with the help of a flashlight. Even the police officers who were looking for Hart at the time, veterans of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, got lost in the forest more than once in daylight, despite the help of dogs and helicopters. In any case, no one else was charged with the Scout murders. Ted Limke, an inspector with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, said confidently that there was no need to keep the case open because the jury had let the man who committed the murder go free. Michelle, Lori, and Dennis were supposed to be in a safe place, enjoying the summer and meeting new people. It's unbearable to think of their families waiting for them 2 weeks later, with stories of incredible adventures at the camp and a desire to spend the remaining summer days with their loved ones. It's equally sad that Camp Scott closed after the murders and has stood abandoned and desolate ever since. It feels like the camp died with the girls in June of 1977. And the saddest thing is that, as the investigator in the case correctly noted, the simplest light bulb would have been enough to dispel the night darkness of the Camp Scott camp and prevent the tragedy that occurred. On the evening of February 17, 2025, at 8:42 p.m., 56-year-old Kimberly Sullivan called emergency services. The woman was in a panic. She reported that her house was engulfed in flames and begged firefighters to hurry. Soon, the wail of emergency vehicle sirens pierced the quiet of Waterbury, a suburb of Connecticut. On the second floor of the house, a fire was indeed raging, and inside, on the floor amidst the chaos of smoke and flames, lay a person, or rather the shadow of a living person. Sunken cheeks, skin stretched tightly over bones, his legs wouldn't straighten. All his teeth had rotted, his hair was matted, and his body was caked in ingrained dirt. It was unbelievable that he was still alive. He weighed just 31 kilograms, 68 pounds. A firefighter carried the victim out of the fire in his arms. Paramedics rushed to treat him when he calmly and clearly stated that he had started the fire himself. He had lit the flames in which he nearly died. But why? "I wanted to reclaim my freedom," he said. That winter evening, the firefighters saved him more than once, though at the time they didn't realize it. Believing they were rescuing him from the flames, they had also torn the victim from the grasp of an evil stepmother. Who would have thought that on the most ordinary street, in the most ordinary American suburb, a family could keep such a horrifying secret for so long, protecting from the world a truth about a stepson, a son, and a brother who had been kept locked away for 2 whole decades? A tiny room, scraps of food, complete isolation, and an indescribable, animal-like fear. That was this young man's life. Even prisoners are treated better than how his own closest family treated him. This is a shocking story that continues to unfold before our eyes. It's still unclear how it will end, but we now know how it began. Craig Sullivan and Tracy Valloran married in 1992. Sadly, the marriage lasted only 2 years. Still, during their short relationship, the couple had a son, born in 1993. He would go on to become the victim at the heart of this disturbing story. And while his name can be found online, officially it remains undisclosed. For personal reasons, after the divorce, Tracy Valloran was forced to grant full custody of her son to Craig. The boy was raised by his father, and soon a new woman entered their lives. Kimberly Boyle, later known as Kimberly Sullivan, after marrying Craig in 1995. Before long, the family grew with the arrival of 2 girls, the boy's half-sisters, Alyssa, born in 1996, and Jamie, born in 1997. At first glance, they seemed like a typical American family, but only at first glance. The first to take a closer look at the family's life were the boy's elementary school teachers. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, he attended Barnard Elementary School, where staff began noticing that something wasn't right. Though in hindsight, those were only early warning signs. The boy was noticeably small, underweight, and short for his age, and he was constantly hungry. He stole food from other children, begged for extra portions, and even ate from the trash. When school staff gently asked him about it, the boy explained that he wasn't allowed to take food at home. That shocking statement pushed the school to take action. A battle began between the school and the boy's family. The school contacted the Sullivan family multiple times about the boy's condition, and when that didn't help, they called the Department of Children and Families, DCF. At least 20 times they reported that the boy was being neglected and even not being fed. DCF caseworkers visited the home twice, both times giving advance notice. Their last visit took place in 2005, when the boy was 11 years old. This time, it wasn't the school that contacted DCF. It was the parents of neighborhood children who had grown worried after not seeing their friend for a long time. Even other children were concerned about him, but during the official visits, the officers saw no signs of abuse. The house was clean, the kitchen stocked with food, and the boy himself said that everything was fine. Now we know the truth. He had been forced to say that. He was terrified, and he lied. But DCF concluded there was no reason for concern. They closed the case and left a defenseless child alone with a cruel stepmother. Perhaps they shouldn't have warned the family ahead of time. Perhaps they should have spoken to the boy in a neutral, safe location. But they didn't. In April 2005, the Sullivans made an unexpected move. They accused the school of harassment. They claimed the school's accusations were unfounded, and yet the school continued to file complaints with the Department of Children and Families. The police found nothing improper in the school's actions. The staff had been acting strictly according to protocol, but under pressure, the Department of Children and Families closed the case. By the end of that same year, the boy stopped showing up at school altogether. His stepmother first claimed he had been transferred to another district, and later said he was now being homeschooled. Just like that, an 11-year-old child vanished from the education system, and nothing happened. If only someone had removed him from that home in 2005, but they didn't. Teachers, the school principal, even the boy's friends tried to raise the alarm, but the authorities failed him, and so began his years of imprisonment. For as long as he could remember, and that memory stretched back to around age 3, he was always hungry. As a child, he would sneak out of his room at night, searching for food and water. But when his stepmother discovered candy wrappers or signs of food he had eaten, she began locking him in his room. At first, it happened only in the evenings, but from then on, there was always some kind of lock on the door. First a chain lock, then a padlock, later a sliding bolt. Thankfully, during his early school years, he managed to eat at school. Kind classmates shared their lunches, and he wasn't above digging through the trash if needed. But when he turned 11, he was pulled out of school, supposedly to be homeschooled. Once the family moved into the house that would, 2 decades later, become known as the House of Horrors, he was initially given a real bedroom, then a smaller one, and finally a tiny space on the second floor, more a closet than a room. It measured roughly 2 by 3 meters, about 6.5 by 10 feet, with a sloped ceiling. It had no heating in the winter and no air conditioning in the summer. He had lived there since the age of 12, and since he no longer had to go to school, his stepmother decided he no longer had any reason to leave the room at all. The older he got, the less time he was allowed outside that cramped, sweltering, freezing space. That alone would have been hard enough, but it was the constant gnawing hunger that made every day unbearable. His stepmother fed him only once or twice a day, usually 2 peanut butter sandwiches and a tuna or egg salad. That was his feast, along with 2 of the smallest water bottles she could find. A growing teenager needs food. He needed strength. He needed nutrition. Instead, he got less and less. He was hungry every single day of his life, and with so little water, he sometimes drank from the toilet tank just to survive. His daily routine never changed. Every morning around 8 a.m., his stepmother would unlock the door, only so he could do chores around the house. That could take anywhere from 15 minutes to a couple of hours. Once he finished, he was allowed to return to his room, and there, locked in that tiny, filthy space, he would spend more than 20 hours a day. Very rarely, only when his stepmother and half-sisters were out of the house, his father would let him out. Sometimes they would watch TV together. Occasionally, they worked side by side in the garden. But as his father's health began to decline, even those small moments of joy became increasingly rare. The toilet situation became a problem almost immediately. When he was younger and still locked in only at night, the family would at least leave a chamber pot in his room. But later, even that small privilege was taken away. He wasn't allowed to leave the room. And of course, there was no functioning toilet in the tiny space they called his room. So what was he supposed to do? Soil himself? Instead, the young man devised a system. Using a plastic water bottle and drinking straws, he created a makeshift mechanism to funnel urine through a small gap in the window frame. For more serious needs, he would spread newspaper on the floor, relieve himself, then carefully roll it up, tie it with a homemade string made from an old t-shirt, and dispose of it discreetly in the kitchen trash. But only when he was let out to do chores. By 2025, he hadn't bathed in over a year, maybe even 2. Back in his school years, he had been allowed to take a bath every other day. But like everything else in his life, those moments became less and less frequent. So he decided to wash himself, as best he could, in his room. Since he was only given 2 small bottles of water a day, he used one for urination. The second he kept in his room. Every day he would ration it carefully, saving just a sip, a few precious drops, and pour them into the other bottle. When enough had accumulated, he would try to clean himself. He had no soap, but in the room stood a bottle of men's cologne, which he used to mask the odor. His stepmother used to cut his hair, but she hadn't touched it with scissors or clippers in 3 years. His long, tangled, filthy hair made that painfully clear. As for medical or dental care, it was completely out of the question. At most, Kimberly would give him aspirin. He hadn't seen a doctor since childhood. By then, his teeth had decayed so badly that they broke apart during meals. The only time he was ever allowed to leave the house was on Halloween. When he was little, Kimberly would let him go trick-or-treating with his sisters at the neighbors' houses. The last time he tasted a normal life was at age 12, when he dressed up as a firefighter. After that, even this small joy was forbidden. He wasn't allowed to have friends, while his sisters could have both boys and girls as friends, but they never broke one rule. Friends were never allowed inside the house. Kimberly told her stepson when he was still very young that under threat of death, no one was to see him. If the secret got out, he and others in the house would suffer. This atmosphere extended to his sisters, and probably even to his father. Guests rarely ever came to the house, but if someone did, the boy was ordered not to make a sound. His late father, late grandmother, and sisters all knew. They never locked him in. They just knew that while they went about their lives, sitting in a kitchen full of food, in the next room a starving stranger was locked away. His half-sisters had long grown into adult women and moved out, one working at a veterinary clinic, the other helping elderly people. Both lived normal lives, while their brother was locked in a room and never told anyone. Even after leaving the family nest, they continued to visit their mother just to check in or for holidays. Imagine how they would unwrap presents at Christmas, eat birthday cake, all the while knowing that in the next room sat a person who would be grateful for a crust of bread. Why didn't he tell anything to the Child and Family Services workers who tried to talk to him in 2005? Why didn't he try to run out of the house, break a window, or call for help from the neighbors? He was scared. Kimberly had threatened him that if he tried to escape or make a scene, he would be locked up for even longer, and he didn't want to risk losing that small freedom. Once, while cleaning the house, he found a weapon. But instead of thinking about how to use it to help himself, he got even more afraid, worried that someone might use it against him. His stepmother had skillfully instilled fear and obedience in her stepson. For years, she kept telling him that soon, very soon, she would unlock the door and let him out for longer periods, but only if she could trust him. Of course, that never happened. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this case is not just how Kimberly managed to intimidate the victim. Considering he was just a child and this was the only family he knew, the boy probably saw no other way out. Yet if proven in court, Kimberly also managed to intimidate the boy's grandmother, her husband, and both daughters. She created an all-encompassing atmosphere of fear even among the adults. And her husband never even triggered the instinct to protect his son. As hard as it may be to believe, stories like this are not uncommon. Even an adult can be convinced of anything. On our channel, you may have already heard about Louise Osborne, a young McDonald's employee accused of theft by a fake police officer, which led to the worst day of her life. A living nightmare and the cruelest prank imaginable involving her adult colleagues. Or take the case of Patricia Aguilar, who trusted her kidnapper and ended up held captive for 548 days in a real cult. Almost anyone can be convinced of anything, especially when vulnerable like Patricia or like Louise, who was not used to questioning authority figures. And what can one say about a child living under the roof of their abuser? Despite the harsh conditions he lived in, the young man showed a keen interest in learning and a sharp mind. At first, he was given some school assignments to do, but they soon stopped because no one intended to check them. Realizing no one would take care of his education, he taught himself as best he could. He was given only 3-4 books a year. There was also a dictionary in his room, and whenever he encountered an unfamiliar word in a book, he would look up its meaning. At one time, he had a small black and white TV in his room, but as technology quickly advanced, it became a useless box. However, there was a radio nearby. Actually, the radio's real purpose was to drown out any sounds he might make when no one else was home. This happened often since the rest of the family worked or studied. Krieg worked at gem manufacturing and Sullivan hardwood floors. His stepmother also worked, including at JCPenney, and his sisters went to school. Through the radio, he could keep track of the date, listen to the news, basketball games, and NASCAR races. This small connection to the civilized world was not taken away from him, which helped keep him sane. His mind was constantly active. And when the young man was finally rescued, the officers were surprised to find he understood everything they asked him. After his father, Krieg Sullivan, who had been confined to a wheelchair for a long time, passed away in early 2024, the young man's situation only worsened. His stepmother became the sole person deciding his fate. Sometimes she would allow him to leave the room for just a minute, for example, to let the dog outside. If before he had at least some hope for help from his father, now even that hope was gone. In this house, in that dirty little room, he transformed from a child into an adult. But he only realized that another year of his life had passed thanks to the radio and the changing seasons he could observe through the window. Although the window was closed, he had a slight view of the road and watched the cars of people passing by, unaware of his existence. The morning of February 17th, 2025, passed like any other morning in his life. He did some household chores and washed his stepmother's car. After giving him 2 sandwiches and a snack, Kimberly sent him back to his room. At 7 in the evening, she let him out again so he could try to change the light bulb on the Christmas tree in the living room. When he failed, she sent him back. At 8 o'clock in the evening, he heard the stepmother's door close. He hadn't developed a rescue plan during the day, but at some point he just made up his mind. He would start a fire. He understood that after lighting the fire, he would have to let it burn fiercely enough so that the stepmother wouldn't be able to put it out herself and would be forced to call the firefighters, or the neighbors would call them. In any case, the fire had to be strong enough. His plan was as daring as it was dangerous. On the evening of February 17, 2025, he took hand sanitizer as an accelerant and soaked some printer paper with it. Recently, he had acquired a lighter. After his father's death, his stepmother had given him some of his father's belongings. By chance, a lighter was in one of the pockets, unnoticed by anyone. So the young man started a fire on the floor near the door and waited. Only when the fire had grown strong enough did he start knocking and calling for help. The stepmother shouted from her room, asking what he wanted. He replied, "Fire!" Kimberly unlocked the door and asked what he had done. He answered that he thought the radio was broken. The fire was already very intense. The young man rushed through the burning doorway and fell unconscious at the top of the stairs. The stepmother forced him to get up and go to the bathroom downstairs to wash up, fearing that the firefighters would see him in his true condition. Of course, the emergency workers wouldn't notice that a grown man weighed only 31 kilograms. The main thing was that his face was clean. He fell again near the front door. The stepmother ordered him to get up, but he deliberately stayed down so the firefighters would find him. In his view, this was his only way out of the house. Almost simultaneously with the firefighters, the victim's sister arrived with her boyfriend. The young man knew this because he heard the stepmother yelling at them to grab a screwdriver and remove the locks from the door. That was what worried her, how to hide what she had been doing all these years. And the question immediately arises, was the sister's boyfriend aware of what was happening? After all, if he entered the house, he must have seen an unfamiliar, emaciated young man lying on the floor in the hallway and understood that his life was more important than some locks. When the firefighters arrived, Kimberly was standing outside, safe, holding a dog in her arms. When asked if anyone else was still inside the house, she said her stepson. The firefighters moved Kimberly away from the burning house because it was dangerous and carried the victim out. He weighed so little that one firefighter could carry him alone, even though he was wearing heavy protective gear and an oxygen tank on his back. The victim had burns and had inhaled smoke, so the medics immediately began providing medical assistance. The young man was on the brink of life and death, but found the strength to make a confession right there that shocked everyone. He said that he had intentionally started the fire because he wanted to regain his freedom. He knew he might die, but risked his life to save it. Death or terrible burns were better than the existence he had lived in captivity. After his confession, detectives and the police chief arrived at the house. As he later admitted during a press conference, the officers could hardly believe the story he told. It was simply unimaginable. When the police learned that the victim had nothing of his own, they collected some money to buy him clothes, books, and other items to lift his spirits. That same night, Kimberly was taken to the police station for questioning. However, she refused to speak with the investigators. Meanwhile, the fire was extinguished, and forensic experts began working at the house as a potential crime scene. They easily found evidence that confirmed the victim's story. The storage room where the young man had lived was cold, dirty, and extremely uncomfortable. The door was secured not only with a lock, but also reinforced with plywood to make it stronger. Officers also found a homemade funnel for draining urine, just as he had described. Overall, the house looked very filthy and cluttered. Only a few rooms seemed somewhat livable, those where Kimberly lived with her pets. Clearly, Kimberly was the kind of person who couldn't throw anything away or simply didn't care. It was obvious that no guests ever visited her home, but did she not want to clean up for herself? One might think Kimberly had no money for even minimal repairs, but that would be a premature conclusion. Doctors who examined the victim in the hospital noted that the 32-year-old man looked much younger because he was severely emaciated. He suffers from cachexia or wasting syndrome, meaning his weight is far below normal and he lacks muscle mass. The victim's body mass index, BMI, is 11, whereas for his age and height, it should be at least twice as much. Generally, a BMI below 16 is considered severe underweight, and below 13 is life-threatening. Now, doctors are doing everything possible to prevent refeeding syndrome, which can even be fatal. If food and water are given too quickly, the body, no longer able to properly absorb and metabolize nutrients, may fail. This can cause electrolyte imbalances and heart failure. In addition, the young man's legs have limited mobility. He obviously suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Despite trying to educate himself, he lacks many basic skills, such as knowing how to operate a microwave oven. Investigators spoke with the victim in the hospital on February 21st and March 6, 2025. He gave testimony that revealed details about his life in captivity. In particular, investigators asked him whether he had been beaten or sexually assaulted. He responded that he was never sexually abused and had been hit only once. This happened around 2005, about 20 years ago. He was home alone and, as usual, hungry. So he cut out a piece of the wooden door panel behind which he was locked. The boy did not try to escape, but simply found food and ate it. The child ate food in his own home. When his stepmother found out, she slapped her stepson. After that, she never laid a hand on him again. However, the door was not only locked, but also reinforced with plywood. On March 12, 2025, the police and prosecutor's office announced that they had gathered enough evidence to formally charge Kimberly Sullivan. Neighbors were shocked to see the quiet woman being taken away by the police. They told reporters they had no idea she even had a stepson. They rarely saw Kimberly herself. While children of previous neighbors had played with Kimberly's stepson and were worried when he went missing, the new neighbors didn't even know the boy existed. Yet even they felt guilty. They tried to understand if they could have noticed anything strange or paid attention to any warning signs. They told reporters that if he had broken a window, they would have helped him, but he was too scared. The former school principal also gave an interview. He was angry and had every right to be. He had spoken out at the time, appealing to authorities to intervene, but no one helped the boy. This case again raised the question of why homeschooled children's well-being is not properly monitored. Kimberly remains silent, but her lawyer frequently gives interviews, each time seeming to test the waters to gauge what line of defense will be accepted by the public. He stated that Kimberly denies all accusations. According to the lawyer, the victim is lying or mistaken, he was not locked in a room, and he had food and shelter. Allegedly, Kimberly is shocked by the allegations. The lawyer added that the responsibility for raising the stepson lay with Greg, Kimberly's late husband, and any harsh measures taken in raising the boy were at his direction, not Kimberly's. When asked on the day of the fire whether her stepson had mental health issues, Kimberly said that Greg was against doctors, so no diagnoses were made. Although she had taken her stepson to a psychiatrist several times because he was harming himself. Overall, it's convenient to blame the deceased, but this statement doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Greg Sullivan died a year ago, so why did the stepmother keep her stepson locked up for a year after his death if it was his decision and not hers? Kimberly clearly took care of herself. Her clean clothes, bleached hair, jewelry, and manicured nails show that. Moreover, the stepson clearly stated that his grandmother, sisters, and father knew about his ordeal, knew he was kept locked up, but none of them ever locked him in. In addition, Kimberly's lawyer claimed the accusations are based solely on the victim's word. This is not true. His claims have been confirmed by neighbors who knew the boy as a child, as well as school teachers and the principal. Furthermore, Child and Family Services staff managed to locate records related to his case. According to Connecticut law, they could have destroyed them after 5 years since the investigation was then closed, but fortunately, some documents were preserved and they have been found. Considering the harm caused to the victim, the prosecution promises to seek the maximum punishment for Kimberly Sullivan. She is charged with first-degree assault, second-degree kidnapping, first-degree unlawful restraint, as well as criminal negligence and cruelty to another person. She faces up to 45 years for the first 3 charges and an additional 2 years for the latter offenses. After the truth about the so-called House of Horrors was revealed in the press, several family members of the victim gave interviews. First and foremost, everyone wanted to hear from the victim's biological mother, Tracy Valoran. She explained that for personal reasons, she had given full custody of her son to his father. She believed this was the best decision for her son, and although it was difficult for her, she trusted he was growing up in a loving home. Tracy, of course, tried to meet her son. Her ex-husband would tell her where he would be walking with the boy, and Tracy would wait for hours at the designated place. But they never showed up. Tired of her ex-husband's excuses and deceit, Tracy reached out to his brothers, who promised to help, but they also failed. Now she has learned that she lived only 20 minutes away from the house where her son was held captive. Tracy has a daughter, Heather Tessman, who is now 35 years old and is the victim's half-sister. Heather said she remembers seeing her brother when he was 3, but never again afterward. When her brother turned 18, she actively searched for him on social media. Heather also laments that she lived less than 20 kilometers away, but was unable to help him. The victim's uncle, Kurt Sullivan, brother of Greg Sullivan, said he hadn't seen his nephew since 2004 or 2005. He had visited his brother's family every Christmas Eve for several years until they pushed him and his wife away. Kurt remembered the victim as a thin, polite boy. He tried to ask him questions, but the stepmother always interrupted. Later, he tried to contact him again, but received no reply. Kurt admits he was worried about his nephew. 10 years ago, he spoke with a private investigator who suggested checking death records at the Statistics Bureau. Kurt saw his nephew at the hospital after the fire and mourns that he looked like someone who had survived the Holocaust. The victim's mother, Tracy, added that it would be just for everyone who lived in that house to be placed in solitary confinement and fed only 2 cups of water a day. Since Kimberly Sullivan had no prior police records, the judge allowed her to post bail set at $300,000. She managed to pay the amount, which surprised many given the poor condition of her home. On March 26th, when Kimberly appeared in court again, the prosecutor said he had met the victim at the clinic where the young man is recovering. The victim follows the case through TV and social media. His first question to the prosecutor was, "Why is she free when I spent 20 years in that little room?" Public opinion shares his sentiment. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that an electronic ankle monitor be placed on Kimberly and that she be put under house arrest. In response, Kimberly's lawyer argued that since the last court session, nothing had changed. She complied with all bail conditions. Tightening restrictions would violate her rights. Faced with this dilemma, the judge decided not to place her under house arrest, but ruled that she must wear an electronic monitoring bracelet. Kimberly currently lives with one of her daughters. The prosecutor also revealed that they have a witness, a longtime friend of Kimberly, who said they had been close for 21 years. However, Kimberly never mentioned having a stepson, and the friend was never invited to the house. It's unfathomable how someone could treat a stepson that way. Why wasn't he put up for adoption? Why isolate herself without allowing a close friend into the home for over 20 years? If it were about insurance or property fraud related to Greg Sullivan, as some commenters suggest, why did the abuse start in the boy's early childhood? Considering the charges and the condition of Kimberly's home, there is a possibility she suffers from a mental disorder. Of course, the defense may try to shift blame onto Greg, but the abuse lasted too long and was too severe. Fortunately, Kimberly's stepson is alive and points to his stepmother, not his father, as the primary abuser, making it difficult for her to justify her actions. Truth can be worse and more frightening than fiction. It's hard to imagine what kind of torment could break a person's spirit while not completely destroying their will to live in desire for freedom. Currently, the prosecution and police continue gathering evidence. If the case goes to trial, the victim, key prosecution witness, will testify about 20 years of solitude, cold, and hunger he endured constantly. The defense will struggle to counter such a powerful testimony. Alternatively, Kimberly may opt for a plea deal. Either way, she is unlikely to be released soon. Until proven guilty, she remains an innocent person at liberty. Most importantly, the victim is recovering under close medical supervision, and one can only hope that with each passing day, his will to live and strength to pursue his dreams grow stronger.
In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. 2 brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but 2 separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, he would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, The sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time. As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw 2 men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase, just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw 2 men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, 2 inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen 2 men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of 2 inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the 2 convicted individuals contradicted not only each other but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw 2 men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with 2 dark blue or black doors at the back and 2 doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the two inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, the outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Steen revealed that he, along with two friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that two men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for three men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it. But even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found, where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant, allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Steen and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbett brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the D&NW store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the 3 men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the 3 men. None of the 3, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance. Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were 2 letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen, besides the police's version implicating the Tibbetts brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, when the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime.